Part 2, Pope Pius XII, Vindication. We're going to be looking at this book review that appeared in the New Oxford Review in March of 2017. The name of the book is Church of Spies, the Pope's Secret War Against Hitler.
The Pope's Secret War Against Hitler.
And the author, his name is Riebling.
Mark Riebling?
Oh, Riebling.
Riebling or Riebling?
That's an E. That's an E. All right. I think it'd be pronounced Riebling.
Okay.
Mark Riebling. And it starts off, the decades-long controversy over whether Pope Pius XII failed to do and say enough to thwart Nazi atrocities has been dubbed the Pius Wars. I didn't know that. But Mark Riebling has struck a firm blow for Pius's defenders by using recently unsealed transcripts and files to turn the oft-repeated narrative on its head. Riebling builds his case around Bavarian lawyer Joseph Miller. Now, that's that German spelling, M-U with the two little dots. Like the case of the former head of the CDC, Cardinal Miller. So this is Joseph Miller, spelled with an F, whom the Nazis called, quote, the best agent of the Vatican intelligence in Germany. The Nazis, now I don't know if it's in here, because I won't be able to cover it all, but I don't know if it's in here or whether I read it someplace else on the internet, that in 1940, after the surrender of France, the invasion of Holland, Belgium, France, and Luxembourg, there were a group of German generals. There were some German generals. I can't remember whether they came in person and met with Pius XII, or they sent a message that they wanted to overthrow Hitler and to then give back freedom to France, Belgium, and Holland, Luxembourg, and reconstitute Poland and Czechoslovakia. Poland had been divided with the Russians, and Czechoslovakia had been absorbed into the Third Reich. And anyway, Pius XII then passed this on to the British. Because we weren't at war at that time, remember? This is 1940. It was England alone at that point. And anyway, the English lost interest because of the French. Now, I can't understand why the French would have been a problem. I don't know, because, see, the French by that time were divided. You had the Vichy French, that there was a loose alliance between the Vichy French. Marshal Pétain was their president, and they had a capital in Vichy in southeastern France, and they retained control of it, and they retained control of all of the colonies, all of the French colonies in Africa, Indochina, and anyway, and de Gaulle, of course, he was organizing the Free French in England, and so I don't know, that might have been the Free, but it said that the English eventually lost interest, and so this whole idea of these German generals didn't come to fruition. But anyway, this Joseph Miller, who was called the best agent of the Vatican intelligence in Germany. The Nazis eventually arrested Miller for protecting Jews and conspiring to kill Hitler, and accused him of, quote, using the spy service of the Catholic clergy. A war hero, that means World War I, a war hero. By the way, there's a great movie about a Jesuit priest that also was beatified by Pope John Paul. His name was Rupert Mayer. He lost a leg. He was a chaplain in the German army in World War I and lost a leg. And he became this outspoken opponent of the Germans there in Munich. And he spent much of his life in prison.
Mm-hmm.
There's a movie about him.
Mm-hmm. I'll look it up.
Yeah, a movie about him. I discovered it accidentally, and at the time of the movie, he hadn't been beatified yet. So later, I found out that Pius XII had beatified him.
Mm-hmm.
Well, a war hero and this Joseph Miller was a war hero from World War I, a godfather figure in Munich. Mm-hmm. Mueller led troops, smuggled documents, played politics, plotted murder, wrote sermons, rescued Jews, ransomed bishops, eluded capture, suffered betrayal, endured torture, confounded his captors. And he acted as a go-between between the German anti-Nazi movement and Father Robert Lieber, advisor to the Pope. And Riebling refreshes readers on the rise of Hitler during the Great Depression, as economic hardship drove multitudes of Germans to embrace the barking Führer and his National Socialist Party. Widespread allegiance to the self-assured, charismatic Nazi leader created a herd mentality that led many to brush off his purges of political rivals, numerous clergy, and Catholic lay leaders. Mm-hmm. Weary citizens were simply relieved to have a man with a plan, any plan. Mm-hmm. But not all Germans were so lulled into conformity. Mm-hmm. And I don't think he mentions, I don't think it's in this, no, I know it's not about the voting pattern in 1933. Mm-hmm. So I wasn't surprised to read some of this. Mm-hmm. The fearless Miller, on an SS list of Catholic opponents of the regime, joined Monsignor Johannes Heschler in a, quote, counter-Nazi secret service, unquote. And Michael Cardinal von Faulhaber asked them to coordinate their work with the Vatican. Now, this is interesting because Faulhaber helped with the first draft of Rennen der Sorge. Mm-hmm. That was the encyclical Pius XI wrote. Denouncing. In German, it didn't appear in Latin. It appeared in Germany because it directed at the German church. Mm-hmm. And the opening words mean with burning sorrow. Mich Rennen der Sorge. Mm-hmm. The papal encyclical that urged, quote, overt acquiescence and, quote, backstairs intercession against the Nazis. Mm-hmm. So it sounded like a passive resistance. Mm-hmm. A passive resistance. Mm-hmm. Well, that was in the first draft. Mm-hmm. When it got written, it was different. Mm-hmm. Because Eugenio Cardinal Pacelli, then Vatican Secretary of State, quote, changed the theme to combat, which drew a vicious backlash against the Catholic Church, clergy, and church properties. Now, in Germany, there was in Munster a very outspoken opponent. His name is Von Galen. He was from the nobility. He was a count. His name was August Clement. And anyway, he was part of the clique with Pius XII that changed the encyclical into a combative one. And it's interesting because he was a Westphalian. And anyway, as the war went on, he became more and more strident. And they wanted to do something. They wanted to shut him up. But Goebbels, head of propaganda for Hitler, if we arrest him, we're going to lose all of Westphalia because those people, they adore him. Right. And but then Hitler said, well, after the war, von Munster will pay to the last penny. So they were going to wait until the great victory. Yeah. But he was also with Pius. He was a German bishop, but with Pius XII, the future Pius XII, turned out a combative encyclical. And the Nazis thwarted the church's teachings, banned its organizations, censored its press, shuttered its seminaries. Remember, Pope Benedict and his brother, they were seminarians, and they wound up in the German army, remember? His brother was wounded, actually, at Casino, of all places.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I read his brother's autobiography. Seized the church's properties, fired its teachers, and closed its schools. Priests were labeled, quote, political enemies of the Germans, unquote, and churches were desecrated. Pacelli, as Pope Pius XII, was a political realist and supporter of militancy, mutiny, and espionage, unquote. And regarding Pius' public relations, Riebling says that the Allied and Jewish press agencies still hailed him as anti-Nazi during the war. But in time, his silence strained Catholic-Jewish relations and reduced the moral credibility of the faith, unquote. And he talks about this campaign after the war, that calumny. But he says here, the spies are the key to the supposed, inaction. Miller later admitted that during the war, his anti-Nazi organization in Germany had always been very insistent that the Pope should refrain from making any public statements singling out the Nazis and specifically condemning them, and had recommended that the Pope's remarks should be confined to generalities only, unquote. Well, there might have been generalities, but like in a Christmas message, the New York Times, they got the message. Now, are you familiar that in the Netherlands, after the Nazi takeover, when they started rounding up some of the Dutch Jews, the bishops of Holland, I think there were 6 dioceses, they issued a statement condemning this. And you know what happened? In 2 weeks, 600 convert Jews, the Catholics who were converted from Judaism, including Edith Stein, they were sent east and were dead. So it made it worse. Yeah. It made it worse. Because the way it was applied, it varied from country to country. In Holland, they were overlooking, whoever was in charge there was overlooking the Jews who had become Catholics. Now, in Poland, for example, it was a capital offense for anyone to aid Jews. Poland was the only country where that was the case. And because there was so much of it going on. I used to have a book, another one of my lost lambs. It's called My Life for Yours. It's the story of, in round numbers, 50 Polish Jewish nuns who were executed by the Nazis. They had orphanages, and they took in, Jewish parents would bring their children, and they then would mix those in with the Catholic kids to conceal them. And like I said, in round numbers, 50 of them that were discovered by the Nazis and were executed. Who knows that? I mean, those Polish nuns were really, really heroic.
For sure.
So anyway, it goes on, Pius relied on German clergymen for updates, and German Jesuit and Dominican leaders formed the Orders Committee, which acted as a front for a church intelligence service. When the Nazis marched into Prague in 1939, they arrested opponents of the Third Reich and imprisoned Jesuits. And Poland was the next target. That is the invasion in 1939. And the SS spy chief declared that Catholic priests, quote, must all be killed, unquote. A lot of priests wound up in Dachau. I knew one. Father Gabel was his name. He wound up here in this country after World War II. There were thousands of Catholic priests and also other clergy, Orthodox and some Protestant, at Dachau. Now, there was one Czech priest, and somehow or another he accumulated all this material, and after the war, I don't know, he was smuggling it out or he kept it hidden or something after Dachau was liberated. Well, then he wrote this big old book. We had little short biographies of all of the priests, all of the Orthodox priests, and the Protestant ministers that were there in Dachau. And I used to have 2 copies of that. Both of them were gone. But anyway, there was this woman in the Archdiocese of San Antonio, Czech woman who read Czech, and she got a copy of this and she read it and showed it to Father Benton Thurman of San Antonio. He then passed it on to Bishop Markowski, who after he retired translated it into English.
Wonderful.
And anyway, that's how I found out about all of these priests there. Now, there was one seminarian who was ordained there. In Dachau.
Wow.
I'm trying to remember the Daughters of St. Paul. They made they have those stories of saints and so forth. It was about the ordination of Father Paul.
Okay.
Was the name of it. We used to have it there in that lending library. We had it at Annunciation. He was dying of TB, and it was obvious he would not survive because a lot of them died there. And anyway, they had an ordination there, and the sisters of St. Paul, daughters of St. Paul, they made a video of that. It mentions here, about the imprisonment of a priest, Polish priest. Well, I met 2 of them. There were 2 over in San Antonio. And one of them, I sat alongside him at a meal, and he told me, he said, I knew 2 saints. And I said, yeah? And he said, yeah, I knew St. Maximilian Kolbe, and I knew Titus Brasmus. You probably never heard him. Titus Brasmus was a Dutch Redemptorist, and he was in Auschwitz.
Okay.
I mean,
at
Dachau.
Okay.
And he then was canonized. So many people don't know about this, which is very, very interesting. Some people fell away from the faith because of all of this dispersing of Pius XII. Larry Elder, on the radio, Larry Elder, I heard him so once. He said he left the Catholic Church because of Pius XII. And I had a telephone call one time from a fellow from down in the Bay Area. This is back in the early 90s, I guess. And he was attending an Episcopal church in the Bay Area, and they were getting their first priestess. And he didn't like that idea. So he called me, he wanted to talk about becoming a parishioner of Annunciation. And anyway, I said to him, well, is it just you don't like women? Or is it you realize now the error of the Episcopal Church? And he said, no, I just don't like the idea of a woman. It wasn't that we were right and they were wrong.
I gotcha.
It was a matter of taste, I guess we should say. And then I said, well, that's not good enough. I'm going to tell him, I said, I can't accept you just because of taste. I mean, it has to be because of doctrine.
He liked that.
As soon as I brought it up, guess what he launched into?
Pius XII.
Pius XII. Yeah. What about Pius XII and so forth? And then I tried to talk to him, and tell him, the truth. He wouldn't buy it. So we never saw him. But all of this caused the loss of souls. The fact that people don't realize how much we were persecuted. By the way, this Joseph Miller, guess what? He and the famous Bonhoeffer.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yes, they were collaborating. And I didn't know it until I read this, or maybe it's one of those other things this morning on the internet. One of the places where Bonhoeffer hid out was a Benedictine monastery. Whoever heard about that?
Not me. For sure.
I hadn't either. So anyway, it goes on. It said Polish clergymen also cautioned Pius against denouncing Nazi atrocities so as to avoid escalating the horror. Hence the Pope's double bind. And this is right at the heart of it. He was forced to refrain from condemning evil in order to prevent an upsurge. In unspeakable torture and death. Which reminds me of something, in that thing I was talking about, Dachau, that book, when Pius XII would make statements that the Nazis didn't like, the jailers at that camp, they'd take it out on the priests and the Protestant ministers too. Yeah. And the Protestant ministers, they would complain to the priests. So, hey, your Pope is causing us to have a hard time from our German jailers.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, so there was a real fine line that he followed. And then the author of this book, Riebling, states, quote, the intrigues that followed would not be the Church's covert campaign against the Reich, but the Pope's secret war against Hitler. Furthermore, quote, just as Hitler, not the German state, was the target of the plot, so Pius, not the Roman faith, would be is better. So he was not so much Hitler's Pope, after all. Once after the Fuhrer learned of an intelligence leak, Admiral Canaris assured him that Joseph Miller, the leaker, was on the case. According to Miller, the Admiral, quote, the Admiral had turned me into the leader of the investigation against me, unquote. Can we stop for a moment?